So this is the iPhone 12, not the Pro, not the Pro Max, and not the Mini. But if you're someone who's seen pretty much any other video on my channel, then you'll probably have a pretty good idea that I'm an Android user through and through. Now, with that said, I've always really appreciated the simplicity and fluidity of iOS itself. And so this year, I wanted to purchase what I considered to be the best value iPhone out of the new flagships, that is, and use it for as long as I could so that I could give you my thoughts on this device from the perspective of a hardcore Android enthusiast. And I'll be honest, with the direction that Android software has been heading in over the past couple of years, in some ways becoming a little bit more restricted like iOS, and then with iOS recently introducing widgets and starting to look like they're allowing for more flexibility, I'll admit that I was a little bit nervous coming into this review. Like, what would happen if I just straight up preferred using the iPhone 12 over all of the other Android devices that I've used and reviewed this year? What would that mean for my channel? Now, you can breathe a sigh of relief. I will be returning back to using an Android device following this review, but what I can tell you is that I've been really pleasantly surprised with my experience of using the iPhone 12. So with that said, let's dive in and discuss my thoughts on this phone. Starting with the design, this is just about the biggest new change to the iPhone lineup this year. You've seen it all before, no doubt, but with this year's lineup, we have these squared off side panels with as flat a display as you can get. And purely from a visual standpoint, I really like it. Holding the phone does take a little bit of an adjustment without those rounded edges, and the phone kind of digs into your hand a little bit. I'm sure some people will find this fairly uncomfortable at first, but you do get used to it, and I've even started to enjoy the feel of the iPhone 12 in my hand. Now, one of the biggest downgrades though when comparing the regular 12 to the 12 Pro models is that the regular 12 comes with a glossy glass back. It is a fingerprint magnet, and it was honestly enough of a difference to really make me consider purchasing the Pro instead. I've said many times throughout the various phone reviews that I've uploaded this year that I vastly prefer a matte back on a device in comparison to a glossy back on a device. And as I said, I really do think it is one of the biggest downgrades when looking at the iPhone 12 from a design point of view. But one new similarity that came about this year between the regular and the Pro models is that we now have a beautiful OLED display on the front of the regular iPhone 12s. And this was the game changer for me. Now, Apple's LCD panels have always been some of the best in the past, but once you start using OLED panels, it's really hard to go back. And the panel on the iPhone 12 is fantastic. Super bright, great for outdoor use. The colors are also really natural and pleasing as well. And even though we're stuck at a refresh rate of 60 Hertz, because of how Apple has designed and optimized its OS, I honestly didn't really notice the difference when switching back and forth between this phone and the Android phones that I have that use a 90 Hertz panel. It's a little bit more noticeable when switching to phones that have 120 Hertz panels, but still not as big of a difference as I was expecting. Now, would I have loved to have seen Apple's version of a high refresh rate screen on this year's lineup of phones? Absolutely. And it would have definitely convinced me to go with the Pro model had it been a Pro exclusive feature. But alas, none of this year's iPhones have it, so he's hoping they finally introduce it next year. Now, one benefit of not having a higher refresh rate panel though is battery life. And when it comes to battery, this phone has been performing very well for me over the past few weeks. I haven't been able to kill this thing in a day, never even gotten close. I'm usually ending the day with about 30 to 40% of battery life left and about 4 to 4.5 hours of screen on time. So definitely a solid performer in regards to battery life. Now, one other new inclusion on this year's lineup is MagSafe. So I picked up one of these MagSafe chargers. It cost me 80 damn bucks here in Australia, but I've got to say, I don't like it. So the convenience of wireless charging for me is that I can place my phone down, but then pick it up really easily without really any interruption. Now, obviously the MagSafe charger gets that first part right, but then how it differs to regular wireless charging is that if I want to then pull the phone up off the charger to start using it or to head out the door, now it's actually a two-handed job to get those magnets to disconnect. So that convenience of just picking my phone up off the charger and walking out the door, it's not really an option with the MagSafe charger. Now, some will say, oh, but this is a cool new way where you can now use wireless charging and hold your phone at the same time. But I don't want to use wireless charging while I'm holding the phone. That kind of makes it not wireless charging anymore. Anyway, I get the premise, I just don't love the execution. And MagSafe definitely isn't a replacement for wireless charging. It's actually more so a replacement for wired charging, and in some ways, a more annoying replacement. And in every way, a much more expensive replacement. And then we have the cameras. And when it comes to the regular iPhone 12, the only things that we're missing out on in comparison to the 12 Pro is that 2x telephoto lens and the LiDAR scanner. But we have that same main sensor and that same ultra-wide lens, both of which are fantastic performers. Particularly for video, where I still think the iPhone lineup is the best in the business. All right, so here we are with the main sensor on the back of the iPhone 12. We're shooting at 4K 60, and it's great because all lenses on this phone, including the ultra wide and the selfie camera, they let us shoot at 4K 60. But now switching over to the ultra wide lens on this phone, and I'm just holding the phone the same distance away from my body as I was in the previous test, and look at this field of view. Look at the dynamic range as well. It's honestly very comparable to the performance from the main sensor, and yet we have this super wide field of view, which is great. And then finally over to the selfie camera. We're still shooting at 4K 60, which is super nice. And I think aside from slightly worse performance in regards to dynamic range, I think the actual image quality and audio quality stacks up to the other cameras really well. Now, in terms of cameras, I think the only downside when comparing the regular iPhone 12 to the 12 Pro is that I much prefer that cropped in look for portrait photos, which you actually can't get on the regular iPhone 12 because it doesn't have that 2x telephoto lens. Now, you could of course just crop in post, but it's not quite the same as having that convenience straight out of the camera. Aside from that though, the cameras really are incredible. Now, one way in which iOS always beats out Android for me is the ultra smooth software experience. This is the benefit of having a much more locked OS that doesn't get themed or skinned by third-party manufacturers. You get one OS on all iPhones that's been tailor-made to work alongside their chipsets beautifully. That's just not the case with Android, even, dare I say it, with stock Android devices. Now, the top-end Android phones like the Galaxy Note 20 Ultras or the OnePlus 8 Pros, they do trade bars with iOS in terms of fluidity and just general user experience. And in some cases, they feel even smoother thanks to those super fast refresh rate panels. But I always find that Android phones, even the high-end ones, they just have more hiccups overall than iPhones do. But maybe that's just me. Speakers and haptics on the iPhone 12 are, as always, industry leading here, and we kind of take it for granted with the iPhone lineup because every single iPhone always nails these two features out of the park. So the last thing to talk about, particularly when it comes to the iPhone versus Android debate, is the software. Now, as I said at the start, I was a little bit nervous coming into using the iPhone 12, thinking that I might finally be swayed over thanks to the recent changes brought about with iOS 14. But more or less, the software is very similar to how I remember it back when I reviewed the iPhone XS. The notification system is still a bit of a mess for me, and I just don't understand how whenever I unlock my phone, the notifications then disappear from my lock screen altogether unless I swipe up. The only change of significance is, as I said, the introduction of widgets. And as you can see, you can create some neat looking home screens as a result. And if you're interested in recreating the one that I have on screen, then I've linked the full step-by-step tutorial in the cards and down in the description below. But it's a pretty involved setup process to get something like what you're currently seeing on screen. And to get custom app icons, the apps still have to launch into the Shortcuts application first before then launching into the app that you've chosen. Not a super nice experience. And you lose notification badges as well, which hasn't really helped with the missed notifications issue either. So whilst it's a promising start, it's not enough to convert an Android user just yet. But that's it. That's my review of the iPhone 12. And as someone who's reviewed a lot of phones this year, I really like it. Is it a worthy upgrade over last year's models? I think the 12 is for sure, pretty much thanks exclusively to the fact that we now have an OLED panel. But in all honesty, I'm kind of relieved that I now get to take my SIM out and get back to using Android. But if I wasn't such an Android fanboy, then this is a phone that I could seriously see myself really enjoying.